Hey, do you prefer to find the joy in life, or do you just want some help with that? If so, you're in the right place. So come on in and join the Joy Bunny clan. This is the My Slice of Life podcast. Hello and welcome to the My Slice of Life podcast. My name is Sharon, and for some reason I've decided to call myself your Highland host. Don't know why, but I did, and it stuck. As I record this, I am aware the UK is in turmoil, so I invite you to come and take a break from all the doom and gloom, because there is a lot of it going around, whether you live in the UK or not. But I'm not going to go into that here, because this is where the Joy Bunny clan meets once a week to focus on a whole host of different topics. This season is all about opening the mystery files, and this week is a story I'm thinking and hoping not many of you will know about. Before we dive in, just a wee reminder for you to check out the links in the description below. There's a few of them. There's no mystery there, just a chance for you to check out the blog and the YouTube channel, and also, if you really want to leave me a wee tip for my hours of work and blood, sweat and tears for this podcast on the Buy Me a Coffee page, where there are free downloads too, by the way. Or you could even become a patron, which will give you access to behind the scenes videos, which is basically just like where I chat away to you and fill you in on what I'm doing, that sort of thing. If that's not your cup of tea, that is absolutely fine. But please consider just giving a like, follow, a fabulous review, all that sort of stuff. It really does help me out, because this is such a small podcast and I'm competing with, well, the world, I suppose. So I really do appreciate your support, whatever form you can offer that in. Now, get your coffee, get comfy, and get ready for a weird mystery for you to unravel and solve. This one's odd. For this mystery, we are heading to Edinburgh in the year 1836 to find out all about the fairy coffins. Now, I've been through a lot of different websites, and I've found the best information about the fairy coffins happens in two places. The first was the report by Charles Fort, who was an American researcher and writer. He was well known for his interest in the weird and unusual. And the second is an article for the Smithsonian magazine by Mike Dash. He actually refers to Charles Fort's article a lot in that too. Some of the details vary depending on what articles and sites you read, but the most accepted form of the story is what I'm about to tell you. So in early July 1836, there was a small group of boys, don't know exactly how many, and they were never named, and they were out hunting rabbits in a part of Edinburgh known as Arthur's Seat, specifically on the northeast side of that. And if you've never heard of Arthur's Seat, it's actually an ancient extinct volcano in Edinburgh, and there are several theories about how it got that name, and I'm not going to go into them today. That's a story for another episode. Back to the boys. While they were playing on the hillside, some reports say cliffside, but you get the idea, they came upon some thin sheets of slate which were kind of stuck in the side, so they started pulling away at them and digging them out. What they found was a hole which had formed naturally, by all accounts, on the hillside. Now, it's often referred to as a cave, but that gives the impression of like a large cavern of some sort. But the entrance was only like 1 foot in height and about 18 inches wide. That's quite odd in itself that you find that and it's been covered. But what the boys found inside is even stranger. When they looked in, they found 17 tiny coffins. Each one was only about 3 or 4 inches long. So imagine that, you've got 17 little coffins in this mini cave in this hillside, which used to be a volcano. Now, fewer than half of the 17 survived, however, because as the Scotsman newspaper at the time, it published a first known account of this, saying that, in quotes, a number were destroyed by the boys pelting them at each other as unmeaning and contemptible trifles. End quote. Now, another intriguing detail in the same account states that the surviving coffins were retrieved the next day by the boys' schoolmaster, a Mr. Ferguson, who was a member of a local archaeological society. The coffins were still unopened at this point, but according to the reporter Robert Chapman, he said, Mr. Ferguson took them home in a bag, and that evening he settled down in his kitchen and began to prise the lids up with a knife. Mr. Ferguson took them to the next meeting of his society, and his colleagues were equally amazed. End of that quote. So what was in them? Well, in each one of the coffins was a miniature wooden figure. Now, they were all dressed differently in both style and material, but each figure had a well-carved face, and they were dressed from head to foot in cotton clothes, which many at the time thought it was to represent the dead, although they just didn't know who. Now, the small coffins were described as, and this is a wee quote, regularly shaped and cut out from a single piece of wood, with the exception of the lids, which are nailed down with wire sprigs or common brass pins. The lid and sides of each are profusely studded with ornaments formed with small pieces of tin and inserted in the wood with great care and regularity. End quote. And so our mystery was born. But who put them there and why? And I think to look at that, what we need to do first is go back and find out, what do we really know about the coffins themselves. It's said there were 2 tiers of 8 coffins each, and a third tier being started, but that only had 1 coffin on it. And it's also thought by many at the time that the coffins had been put in the cave singly and at different intervals of many years perhaps, which would have suggested that something would have had to happen for each coffin to be made and then put in place. And this theory came about at the time because in the first tier the coffins were quite decayed, and the wrappings that the figures had on had really pretty much rotted away. In the second tier, however, the effects of age had not advanced so far, and the top coffin was quite recent looking. So at the time they thought, well, they've been put in it, over a long time period, and that's why it looks like that. However, it's believed nowadays really that the difference in the state of decay is more likely to be a result of the fact that the coffins placed on the lower level were probably more affected by things like water damage, just basically weathering getting in, and that's probably what affected it more than them being put in at a different time. So they don't think they were put in at different times, they think this is just down to natural weather damage. Each coffin contained an occupant, that wee figure I was talking about, and the coffin had been hollowed from a solid piece of wood. All the figures were male and have more or less identical facial features. Now, there are pictures of these online, so do go and check them out, and you'll see they've been given open eyes as opposed to closed ones. And I don't know about you, but I would think if they were going to represent a corpse, the eyes would have been closed. So that kind of seemed a bit odd to me, that was people's first thought. It's like, if it's going to represent a corpse, would the eyes be open? Now, the only comprehensive study that I could find note of these fairy coffins as they came to be known strongly indicated that they were all dated post 1800. And the odds were that it was actually after or about 1830. So really only within about 5 years of them being found. Now, when they were investigated by Simpson and I think it's Menifee, they began their work by describing the 8 surviving artefacts, which apparently you can still see today. They're on display in the National Museum of Scotland. And they said that 2 were originally painted pink or red, which is strange, with the interior of one of them being lined with paper, which was made with like rag fibre, and they could date that to after 1780. Then they also found out more recently that the type of wood the coffins were made from was actually Scots pine. So why 2 of them were painted either pink or red, nobody seems to know. That sounds really strange to me. Now, some of the figures inside have arms. It's a figure, you would expect arms, but several of them have had them removed, and it looked like they were taken off to actually get the figure to fit into the coffin. Now, this would lead to the conclusion then that they weren't actually made for the coffins originally. wouldn't it? I mean, that makes sense to me. It's like if you have to take the arms off to get the figure to fit in, then they weren't made for those coffins. And again, when they were studied, it was noted that the feet of these figures appeared to have been painted black, and it was also discovered they were designed to stand upright, but needed some sort of accessory to hold in their hands to do that. So expert analysis concluded that in all likelihood, they were probably toy soldiers, made in about the late 1700s, with their clothes being later additions, so not designed to be put in coffins at all then. It sounds like these are little wooden soldiers, probably had different garments on them or painted on. Certainly if their feet were painted black to look like boots. There is talk of them saying they looked like they had hats on and different things to make it look like they would have worn different clothes other than the ones they were found with. So were they all made and put there at the same time? Apparently, this hasn't been too easy to ascertain, because in one coffin, it's lined with the paper, like I said, made with a rag fibre, but that's a process from about 1780. But the clothes of another one has stitching with cotton thread, and the cotton thread only replaced linen thread from about 1812 onwards. So the dates of the actual clothing is a bit head-scratching, I would say. Other figures, they have like a 2-ply thread used in their clothes, while another one has a 3-ply thread, which they got textile historians in to have a look at this, and they said that only came into the market in 1830. So if you take all this and put it together, my friends, the experts have concluded it's most likely the coffins were interred at some point after 1830. Bear in mind they were found in 1836, so only a few years after they'd been made. And one weird thing that I do want to point out before I go on, which I found really interesting, is that no DNA could be recovered on the dolls, or the figures, the cloth, or the coffins. No DNA. Could it just have been weathered away? Maybe. Don't know, because it would have been a long time after they were found that obviously the DNA testing was done. So that's all well and good about how they were made, but why were they then put into coffins and buried? And by whom? Well, there are a lot of theories, of course, and a popular theory was that the figures were put there as a way to allow the victims of Burke and Hare, the famous body snatchers and murderers, to be able to let their victims rest in peace. Now, the problem with that theory is that the figures that were found in the coffins were all male, but the victims of Burke and Hare were not. The exact number of female victims doesn't seem to be known, but surely they're not going to be, representing the victims of them if, say, none of the figures are in dresses or even skirts. So that doesn't really tie up. And as was often the case in those days, one of the first theories put forward for the finding of these coffins was to do with the supernatural, or in this case, witchcraft. Yeah, this goes down a wee bit of a darker path than I was expecting. I mean, it's dark enough, isn't it? 17 coffins, but Arthur's Seat has long been said to be a favourite haunt of witches, with one area apparently being named Haggis Knowe, which locals believe was a gathering hotspot for witches at the time. There is even a natural spring on Arthur's Seat, which is featured in one of the earliest Scottish witch trials that we still have detailed records of today. And there was another reason that witchcraft was a main theory given for the fairy coffins, but today you would know them as voodoo dolls. In those days, witches using dolls to place curses on their victims had been well known throughout Europe. I mean, for centuries, that's what they were known to do. It was even thought by some, though, that the boys had broken whatever curse had been put in place when they took them out and were playing with them and destroyed some of them. Some people thought, oh, well, the boys broke the curse, whatever curse it was. Nobody ever seemed to find out what it would have been. Some other ideas put forward are more to do with the sailors of the time. And one theory is that the dolls were placed there by sailors themselves as a charm to prevent death on their voyages that they were going to be taking. And a slightly different theory there suggests that these figures were put there as a sort of grave for the souls lost at sea, probably by their families. So was this an attempt to put the sailor souls to rest? Now, a favourite notion for a time was that they'd been put there by grieving families who had lost a child, maybe as a toy for the lost young one. They seem to be the main, most popular ones. So it's either witches, something to do with sailors, or something to do with families who have lost children. But the reality is, nobody knows why 17 tiny coffins, each with their own occupant, were put there, or indeed who went to all that trouble of making them, transporting them up a large craggy hill, only to hide them from view. Now, do you remember at the start of the story I told you about how the boys had played with the coffins, right? And they'd broken quite a few of them, so only 8 of them were brought down by their schoolmaster, Mr. Ferguson. Well, at some point, the coffins which did make it to the bottom of the hillside eventually found their way into the collection of Robert Fraser, who was a South Andrew Street jeweller, and he put them on display in his private museum. But I couldn't find reports or much evidence of how he actually got them. But it seems to be one of those things where all reports say, yeah, somehow he got them in his hands and they were in his collection. But after Fraser's retirement in 1845, the collection was auctioned off, and these were actually described in the sale catalogue as the celebrated Lilliputian coffins found on Arthur's Seat, 1836. Guess how much they sold for? Just over £4. Now, the coffins since then were passed through unknown private collectors until 1901, and that's when a set of 8, together with their contents, were donated to the National Museum of Scotland by the then owner, Christina Cooper of Dumfriesshire. And it is believed that these coffins that were donated were the same ones which had previously belonged to Mr. Fraser in 1836. But again, there aren't enough details available to really confirm it. But then, how many sets of 8 little coffins with wooden figures have we come across? So it's most likely it's going to be the same ones. And so, like I said, these days they're on display. You can go and see them in the National Museum of Scotland. So they're still there. Lots of pictures online, but no real answers, and it's quite frustrating. And that's really all the details I can find on it. So that kind of brings us to the end of a weird mystery of the fairy coffins. And I've done a bit of thinking on this one, and there are a couple of things that I do find weird. Even more weird than finding 17 coffins in a hill. But firstly, if they were made as toy soldiers, right, with their painted black feet, and if they had hats and so on, or were made for hats, I don't think they didn't have hats when they found them, but could they have been used to mark the deaths of soldiers, not sailors? That was my first thought. I thought, if they'd been designed as toy soldiers, and maybe the toys, like they'd find they were supposed to be used to stand up, and they would have been standing up with a rifle or a flag or something, maybe they were taken off the actual accessory, so they could fit in the coffin and then put in a grave. That makes more sense to me than anything, that these are maybe soldiers who have died abroad. The families didn't get their bodies back, so this is the best thing they come up with. The toy soldiers representing soldiers. That makes the most sense to me. That was my thought, and I was so intrigued by that idea that I looked it up, and there isn't any conclusive evidence of Scots soldiers being involved in any wars at that time. If you know better, please do let me know, but I couldn't find any evidence. But I've said that, there is another thing that I find very odd, and that is, if these figures were to honour the dead, why were arms broken off to make them fit into the coffins? Surely that would have been seen as a bad omen of some sort, like a desecration of the body sort of thing. If it was a grieving family, say for soldiers first of all, you wouldn't snap the arms off. If it was representing a family member who had died at war overseas, surely we just make bigger coffins. And if it was families grieving for their children, wouldn't a park area or a nice garden or somewhere be a better place for putting the coffins? Stuck up some hillside, I don't think would have been the best first choice, would it? Maybe it was more to do with some dark ritual. I mean, at this point it wouldn't surprise me. When you look at reasons for putting them where they were found, this little area in a hillside, it's not easy to get to apparently. Not great, the boys were climbing. and then you put these slates over the front of them. If it was to represent, lost family, a garden with flowers, somewhere brighter, cheerier, does seem more likely. So maybe it is more of a darker reason than I wanted to think about. When I first started looking into this, I thought it would be pretty easy to figure out what had been going on, but now I've just realised I've got more questions than answers. So I've got no option now but to hand this one over to you. I'm not so concerned really with who made the figures or even the coffins, because I'm not convinced it was the same person or group who did both. But what I do want to know is, who do you think took them up a craggy hillside and hid them there? And why would they do such a thing? As always, leave your thoughts, whatever they may be, in the comments section. And with that, that brings us to the end of this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it and are as absolutely puzzled as me on this one. But while you're scratching your head wondering what on earth is going on, don't forget to join me for next week's episode, where I'll be opening a new mystery for us to delve into and try and solve. But until then, my Joy Bunny friends, you take care of your wee self.